Welcome to Stories of Hope, where ordinary lives turn into unforgettable tales of courage and compassion. Today's story is about a poor cowboy who, in a moment of danger, chose bravery over silence and saved an Apache girl after a shocking incident in the street. The town was quiet that afternoon, too quiet. The dust rolled lazily across the main street, carried by a wind that seemed tired from days of blowing over nothing but sand and dry earth. The saloon doors creaked with the weight of the heat. The old church bell hung motionless, and the few townsfolk that wandered outside moved quickly, heads low, avoiding the sun. Life in that part of the frontier was hard. Water was scarce, food scarcer, and most carried burdens too heavy to share. But trouble has a way of appearing when no one wants it. From the far end of the street came a sharp sound, a scuffle, then the rough voices of men. People turned their heads, curious but hesitant, because everyone in that town knew trouble when they heard it. And sure enough, there she was, a young Apache girl, no older than 17, her long black hair loose, her dress torn at the shoulder, clutching a small cloth bundle tight against her chest. 3 men surrounded her, their boots scraping against the wooden walkway as they closed in. Their voices were harsh, their tone cruel. They weren't asking, they were demanding. "Don't talk," one of them hissed, grabbing her by the wrist. "Just hand it over." The girl struggled, her dark eyes filled with both fear and fire. She shook her head, lips sealed. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than their shouts. The bundle she held looked worn and ordinary, but whatever was inside, it mattered enough for her to fight. She twisted, tried to pull away, but the men laughed, amused by her resistance. "Come on now, sweetheart. Don't make it harder than it has to be," another man sneered, tugging at the cloth. Across the street, townsfolk had gathered in the shadows. A storekeeper leaned on his doorway, pretending to mind his business. A woman pulled her child inside quickly. A group of men by the saloon whispered among themselves but didn't move. They saw what was happening, but no one dared interfere. The girl was Apache, and prejudice ran deep. To most, her suffering wasn't their concern, but among them was one man who thought differently. He sat slouched on the porch of the saloon, hat tilted low to keep the sun from his eyes. His clothes were faded, patched at the knees, his boots worn down to near holes. He was a cowboy, but not the kind sung about in ballads. He was poor, with no herd to his name, no land, no fortune. Just an old revolver that looked like it belonged in a museum and a weary horse tied up nearby. Yet when his eyes met the scene unfolding in the street, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just sit by. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his spurs clinking softly against the wooden boards. The murmurs around him grew quieter as he stepped down into the dirt. The girl's eyes widened when she saw him, not with recognition, but with the faint flicker of hope that someone, anyone, might stand beside her. The cowboy's voice was calm, steady, but it carried across the street with a weight no one expected. "Let her go." The 3 men turned, startled, then broke into mocking laughter. They sized him up, ragged clothes, empty pockets, an old pistol hanging at his hip. "You?" one scoffed. "A broke ranch hand gonna play hero?" The cowboy's face didn't change. His eyes were sharp, steady, his jaw set with quiet determination. He took another step forward, boots sinking slightly in the dust. "I said," he repeated, his tone harder now. "Let her go." The girl tried to pull free again, but the man holding her only tightened his grip. "Don't talk," he snarled at her, then spat on the ground. "You keep quiet, too. Ain't nobody here gonna save you." But the cowboy didn't flinch. His hand rested near the handle of his revolver, not drawn, not threatening, but ready. He didn't need to show off. The steadiness of his stance was enough to make the townsfolk watching hold their breath. The leader of the gang narrowed his eyes. "You best walk away, stranger. This ain't none of your business." The cowboy shook his head slowly. His voice dropped low, but every word cut through the silence. "It is now." A gust of wind swept down the street, carrying dust into the air, stinging eyes. The tension was so thick even the horses tied nearby shifted nervously. The town had seen many fights, but this was different. This was a man with nothing standing up for someone who had even less. The gang exchanged looks, suddenly unsure. It wasn't just the revolver that unsettled them. It was the fire in the cowboy's eyes, the unspoken promise that he would fight to the last breath if he had to. The Apache girl stopped struggling for a moment, her eyes locked on him. She understood. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, but he was choosing her side when no one else would. Her lips parted, a soft sound escaping as if she wanted to thank him. But he lifted his hand slightly, shaking his head, and whispered firmly, "Don't talk." The words weren't harsh, they were protective. He didn't want her to draw more attention, didn't want her to waste her strength. His eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I'll protect you." The men shifted uneasily, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The cowboy, the girl, the gang, and the silent crowd around them, all suspended in a fragile balance where one wrong move could shatter everything. And as the sun burned above and the dust swirled below, the poor cowboy stood his ground, daring 3 armed men to cross a line they weren't sure they wanted to cross. It was the beginning of a moment the whole town would remember, a moment when silence was more powerful than noise, when a poor man's courage outweighed wealth, and when an Apache girl, alone and afraid, found hope in the most unlikely protector. The silence of the street shattered when the leader shoved the cowboy hard across the chest. The crowd gasped, some stepping back into doorways. Dust rose around them as the cowboy steadied himself, boots sliding slightly in the dirt. "You should have minded your own business," the leader growled, but the cowboy didn't waver. He adjusted his hat with a calm hand, then squared his shoulders again. His revolver gleamed faintly in the sun, not yet drawn, but close enough to remind the gang that he wasn't bluffing. The other 2 men circled around, trying to intimidate him with their numbers. The Apache girl, still clutching her bundle, pressed back against the wall of the general store, her wide eyes fixed on him. Every breath she took seemed to tremble between fear and faith. The cowboy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Don't talk. Don't move. Just stay behind me." The words were meant for her, but the effect rippled across the men as well. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of someone who had faced danger before and survived it. The leader sneered, taking a step closer. "You think one half-starved drifter with a rusty gun's gonna stop us? Boy, you ain't got nothing." The cowboy's eyes didn't blink. "I've got enough." And with that, his hand moved. Not a wild draw, not the reckless flash of a hot-headed gunslinger, but a slow, deliberate pull. The revolver slid from its holster, steady in his grip, aimed right at the leader's chest. The street fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The leader's smirk faltered, though he tried to cover it with a laugh. "You wouldn't try me," the cowboy said, his voice as flat as the desert horizon. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The Apache girl clutched her bundle tighter, her knuckles white. Then, sensing their advantage slipping, one of the gang members reached for his own gun. The cowboy's revolver snapped to the side in an instant, his aim locking onto the man's hand before he even drew. "I said don't." The warning was sharp. "Final!" The man froze, hand hovering above his holster, sweat dripping down his temple. The standoff dragged on, tension stretching until it felt like the air itself would split. The townsfolk peered from their hiding places, eyes wide, witnessing something rare. A poor cowboy, outnumbered and outmatched, holding his ground with nothing but nerve and conviction. Finally, the leader spat in the dust. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. He signaled his men with a sharp jerk of his head. One by one, they stepped back, grumbling, glaring at the cowboy, but unwilling to test him further. Slowly, they melted into the side alley, their footsteps fading until only silence remained. The cowboy didn't lower his revolver until he was certain they were gone. Then, with a slow exhale, he slid it back into his holster. His hand lingered on the handle for a moment, then fell to his side. The crowd began to stir. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see that? Never thought he had it in him. Man like that. Dangerous but honorable." But the cowboy paid them no mind. His attention was fixed on the girl. She stood trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. She opened her mouth, words ready to spill, but he stepped closer and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't talk," he said softly. His tone was no longer commanding, but protective, almost tender. "You don't owe them, or me, any words." Her lips quivered, and though she said nothing, her gratitude shone in her eyes brighter than any speech could have. She nodded slowly, understanding the weight of silence, understanding that sometimes safety is found not in words, but in the presence of someone willing to stand for you. The cowboy tipped his hat and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her small, shaking hand in his. Together they walked down the street, past the murmuring townsfolk who parted to let them through. For once, no one sneered at her heritage, no one mocked his poverty. In that moment, they were untouchable. As they reached the edge of town, the girl clutched the bundle to her chest, glancing back at the street where fear had nearly consumed her. The cowboy noticed, but didn't ask what she carried. He didn't need to know. Some things were sacred, and he respected that. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. The cowboy stopped, looking out toward the endless desert. His voice was calm, steady as ever. "You've got a long road ahead. But you're not walking it alone, not today." For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. She nodded once more, silent but strong. The bond between them had been sealed not by words, but by courage. Behind them, the town whispered of the poor cowboy who had stood against 3 men and won, not with wealth or status, but with honor. And though the Apache girl spoke no words, her story traveled louder than any voice. The cowboy adjusted his hat, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, and together they stepped into the fading light, leaving behind the dust, the fear, and the silence of the street, carrying with them something far greater: hope.